Okay, so chapter 22 is all about what is called descent with modification. Descent with modification, which has since to be described as evolution, and it's all about Darwin's work. The first section of chapter 22 provides a history of what's going on, and then the second and third sections, what we're going to focus on, present Darwin's ideas. Okay, and so I want to tell you something that I want you to remember, and that is that the idea of biological evolution, that animals are not static, but that they change through time, predates Darwin. Darwin was not the first one to propose this. However, he was the most successful person to propose this and to provide an explanation of how they can change through time. All right. So when you look back at Darwin, Darwin was in a unique position to do what he did. Okay, he was upper middle class, and then he married very wealthy. And so it allowed him to actually invest a great deal of time and resources towards scientific inquiry. Okay, so he started off studying medicine, and that didn't work out all that well. He was very squeamish. And so then he went, and basically if you were a well-to-do, intelligent person, you basically had four options. You studied medicine, you studied law, you studied theology, or you just, did academic research, either scientific or philosophy. And so he left medical school, he went to study theology, and then after graduating, basically took an unpaid position as a naturalist and assistant to the captain on the Beagle. Okay, you all are familiar with now what happened on the Beagle, right? Somebody described Darwin's experiences on the HMS Beagle. 5-year journey circumnavigating the globe. Kyle.
So I know he went to the Galapagos.
He did?
He was like recording down like all the different kind of animals and different species.
Yeah, so he took an unpaid job as a naturalist, right? So he at this time, it was fairly rare for them to actually pay naturalists to go and to collect. Although afterwards it became very popular, museums would pay naturalists to go on these explorations to bring materials back. But yeah, I mean, he was a naturalist. He was mostly the assistant to the captain. But yeah, he collected an enormous number of animals, plants, anything he could find that he thought was really interesting and would be helpful for the museum back in England to have. But yeah, the Galapagos Islands were especially important. Any other ideas or things you remember about his experience? Kyle?
I know that when he was looking at he was going from island to island in the Galapagos.
Yep.
And he realized that all the finches, they were all different in little ways. So like some of them would have big beaks for like the kind of seeds that they would have to get.
Yeah, so every island in this archipelago, this series of islands, the Galapagos off the coast of Ecuador, had different types of finches, but they all had finches. Okay, it was very, very interesting, and we'll try to simulate what he did outside, but this is not an archipelago, a series of islands, but we'll try to. It's close to a desert. It becomes very desert-like when you don't have rain. And what Darwin started to find was an enormous amount of evidence that not only do animals change through time, but the distribution of those animals is best explained by descent with modification. That as they change through time, that provides the best explanation for why you find animals where they are. Okay? That's the best explanation for why you find animals where they are. So, specifically, you referenced finches, right, Kyle?
Yes.
On the Galapagos Islands. he argued that the best explanation for those finches on those islands is not that God created a different type of finch for every one of those islands, but instead they descended from the mainland species with modification, and they modified through time and space on the different islands. All right? Somebody tell me some of Darwin's other ideas. So we're now past his experiences on the ship, and we're just talking about either some of his observations or some of what he provided as explanations. Yeah, Mark.
He said evolution through mutation.
Well, he talked a little bit about the source of variation, yeah, and random mutations. Yeah, Rick.
Survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest, which wasn't his original idea, but was an applied idea from Malthus, somebody that studied economics, but then to living organisms. Survival of the fittest. Yeah, Michelle.
Natural selection.
Natural selection, yeah, providing a means by which you could have that descent with modification. Now, he noticed that there was a relationship between the environment and the way the organisms were structured, right? Kyle, you talked about that he noticed some finches had really large beaks, some finches had smaller beaks, and he noticed that there was a relationship between an organism and its environment. And you have this term adaptation. Adaptation. Now somebody define this for us. What is an adaptation? Yeah, Emma.
How the species will change depending on its environment.
Okay. And can it happen below the level of species? So, like, what about just a single population of a species? Can a single population have adaptations not found in other populations? Let's think about, like, people of Scandinavian descent, right? Do they have some features or adaptations to living really, really far north at a very high latitude that you don't find in other populations of humans?
They probably have better lungs.
Maybe. They're very, very, very light-skinned. Very light-skinned, right? You know, like Norwegians. Why can't I think of any other country other than Norway? Denmark, Sweden, right? Very light-skinned. Really works out nicely for living at a really high latitude, where even in the summertime you have a lot of sunlight, but it's very indirect. Very indirect. Okay? So an adaptation is a feature found in a population that increases. Why are we whispering? Secrets don't make friends. So, feature found in a population that increases fitness in a given environment. Bless you. What are the most important terms in this definition provided? Trinity. Feature, okay? So telling us it needs to be something. Now, notice this is a very general word. It could be a behavioral feature. It could be a morphological feature. Wow, this is getting some action. Lydia. Fitness. Oh. And we've talked about fitness before. What is it?
How many babies can
Yeah, it's reproductive output. Reproductive output. Kyle.
environment?
Okay? And let's give an environment, let's lump that with it. Yeah, Rick.
Population.
Population. Trinity.
Maybe increases.
Okay? Put a box around that one. And now we've accounted for probably about 50% of the words there. I think we're good here. So some key aspect to a given environment. What does that mean? Yeah, Katie.
It's like it changes because of the environment.
Yeah, so if the environment changes, the adaptation needs to change as well, right? Or if they are going to become adapted for a new environment, or let's say it this way, if they are adapted for an environment and that environment changes, they are no longer adapted for that environment, right? So it gives you the idea that this is dynamic. It's fluid. It moves as the environment changes. Okay? Yeah, Emma.
So if there's like a species that lives in its like environment where it would normally be found and there's one living in a foreign environment and it adapted to it and then moved back to its like original environment, would all the adaptations change?
Potentially, it depends. Remember, we've talked about character displacement and we've talked about niche partitioning. So if you reintroduce it to where it was before and there are still members of that species present, then it probably wouldn't revert back. If they are reproductively isolated. If they aren't reproductively isolated, then yes, it would revert back as it reproduces with the original population. Yeah, Lydia.
Didn't you talk about how like tigers were about adaptation, like they adapt kind of slowly?
Well, mammals just in general adapt slowly. Mammals have a very low mutation rate compared to other organisms, and well, I mean faster than some, but lower than others. But we tend to have a pretty low mutation rate and long generation times. Okay, and if you have long generation times, it's going to take you a long time to adapt. Okay, so for a given environment, it tells us this is a dynamic process. What about a population? Isa.
I just had a question. I
Yeah.
remember like back when I was in 8th, she talked about something like how like this lady lived at like high altitudes and so she, like her lungs were larger, and then I remember one of the questions on the test was when her kid had that too. I don't remember. Is that which
It depends on why. If she developed, it's not that easy of a question to answer, but most likely yes.
But is that something? Yeah, like that's something that you could pass down even if you weren't born with it. Like,
Most likely yes, yeah. And it would be by epigenetic inheritance rather than genetics. We'll talk about all this genetics and epigenetic inheritance in a couple of weeks. Yeah, Emma.
It's kind of similar to Isabel's. Like I heard this thing, because people use their phone a lot now. They're bending over, so they get like hunchbacks,
Uh-huh.
and then their kids will get like, how does that even happen? Because they weren't born with it. So.
Probably learned behavior.
Oh, okay.
So you tend to model your parents whether you know it or not. Some of it is subtle. So, all right. So population, what's the key aspect here? Referencing population. Can a single individual adapt to its environment? No, it cannot. Okay? And so what I know what you're thinking. What about if we take like a human being and we move them to Scandinavia? Right?
Yeah.
Will your physiology change in response to being at a higher latitude, right? Which just means further away from the equator, not high elevation, okay? Will your physiology change? What do you think? If you were to move, let's say you moved to Norway, do you think your physiology would change in response to having, 4 hours of daylight in the wintertime, 19 and a half hours of daylight in the summertime? Kyle?
Well, it depends on how long you're there.
Okay, and so let's say you spend the rest of your life there. So you're 16? How old are you, Kyle?
15.
Okay. Oh wow, I didn't know I was gonna bring up something. Okay. So let's pretend that you are 20. Okay, that when you are 20 years old, you move to Norway, right? You transfer from wherever you're going to school to a school in Norway, and you live there for the rest of your life. Do you think your physiology will change?
Eventually, yes.
Okay. But have you adapted to your new environment?
Yes.
Not the way we use adaptation biologically, right? Because you are not an entire population. So biologically we would say you acclimated to your new environment, because populations adapt, individuals do not. Now, the way we use adaptation or adapting just in general Sure, but in biology it has a very specific meaning applied at the level of population. Now let's say you took a whole group of people with you, right? Took a whole group of people with you that created, I don't know, you'd have to have some reproductively isolated group of humans like an Amish society, right? A reproductively isolated group of individuals, and you took them and moved them to Scandinavia. Now that population can adapt. Yeah, Isa.
So if an adaptation is only within a population, what is it called when it's only one person?
Acclimation.
Acclimation.
Yep.
Can you spell that?
Or acclimatization.
Why?
That's stupid.
Why?
Acclimatization. I think it's actually that one. So, acclimatization. Yeah. Yep. It's a wonderful, wonderful term. So in your textbook, in chapter 22, there's a figure of some of the different species of finches that Darwin collected, but living forms of them, and showing you that their beaks are shaped based on their feeding strategy, showing the relationship between the given environment and a particular feature, this adaptation, and representing a population. And the reason it is that way is to increase fitness, increase reproductive output. All right? Any questions about adaptation? Okay. Let's see. Let me check something real quick. All right. Dup. All right. So, one more thing, and then one more term or one more definition I want to talk about, and then we can start talking about bigger picture ideas. Okay, the next one is natural selection. So we already talked about adaptation, and now let's talk about natural selection. Somebody define this for us. Isa.
Is this survival of the fittest?
It is.
So basically the organisms with
People work too.
Okay. With the strongest features or most, I guess, adaptable features will survive.
And it's not so survival of the fittest in some ways is a misnomer. It's not necessarily just about survival. It's about what?
Well, it's like adaptation to like.
Yeah, an adaptation is about what?
Like whoever can adapt the fastest to like the newest thing.
And adaptations are about what? Isa? Fitness, right? So natural selection, the survival of the fittest, and this right here is not like, the fastest or the best. It could be, right? It could be the fastest, it could be the strongest, but that's not necessarily what it's getting at. Is natural selection is individuals with the best adaptations. We've already defined adaptation, right? It's a feature you find in populations that increase fitness in a given environment. So individuals with the best adaptations, oh gosh, I need an S. Individuals with the best adaptation leave the most surviving offspring. Okay? So individuals with the best adaptations leave the most surviving offspring. That's the idea of survival of the fittest. That's the idea of natural selection. And so for Darwin, again, Darwin was not the first one to propose biological evolution, that animals change through time, descent with modification. But he was somewhat the first to argue that natural selection is the means by which it happens. Okay? That these populations change through time, because if the individuals with the best adaptations leave the most offspring, over time the population is going to have more and a higher percentage of individuals that have those particular characteristics, that have those adaptations. All right? Okay. So the textbook talks a little bit about another person, Alfred Russel Wallace, completely different person than Darwin. I told you Darwin grew up in an upper middle class family and then married wealthy, was a very privileged person, had an enormous amount of time and resources to invest in scientific inquiry. Alfred Russel Wallace grew up very, very poor. Okay, and he took a job as a naturalist. Now, after this, museums started to pay people to go travel the world on these ships, bring materials back. And Alfred Russel Wallace took a trip on a ship like that as a paid naturalist and came up with basically the same idea that Darwin did, that descent with modification is fueled by natural selection. And he, in 1958, sent a copy of this essay to Darwin. And so Darwin had been sitting on his idea for almost 2 decades. Actually, a little bit over 2 decades, that biological evolution is fueled by natural selection. And so then he published Alfred Russel Wallace's essay and his idea at the same time, that biological evolution is fueled by natural selection. All right? Evolution. Yep, is fueled by natural selection. Okay? Any questions about this? Because I want to talk about Darwin's observations and his inferences. Okay. So Darwin attempted to explain how do you have all this diversity of life, and he explained it through a process of descent with modification. That diversity increases through time as organisms descend and then modify from the source. Also attempted to explain why are there some shared features among all these various types of animals. Okay? So why, say, do cats and dogs that are very different animals, why do they share so many features? And again, the idea would be that because they both descended from the same ancestor and then have modified through time. So the more shared features they have, the closer their shared ancestor is. Yeah, Tori.
Dogs were domesticated before cats were, right?
I don't know. I think so. I think a long time before, but I don't know exactly the dates. And the idea now is that wolves basically domesticated themselves. That they.
Right, because they. So
Yeah.
did cats domesticate themselves too?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. And then one more thing that Darwin tried to explain is why do organisms seem to be designed to fit their particular environment? Yeah, Emma.
How are there so many different breeds of dogs?
How many you're talking about domestic dogs?
Yeah.
Because there's an enormous amount of genetic potential inside of organisms.
Like, how do they breed them? Like, for example, like a bulldog. How's a bulldog bred?
I mean, you just decide you want a breed of dog with a flat face and a very muscular body, and so you only allow the individuals with the flattest faces and the most muscular bodies to produce offspring, and then through time you have a bulldog. Yeah.
You strike me as a cat person.
Why?
I don't know. The red hair. But do you have a dog?
That's so interesting. I don't have any pets because my wife hates animals. Yeah. But it's okay. I grew up with dogs and cats, but I only shared the responsibility of caring for them. My kids are too young to share the responsibility of keeping an animal alive, and I don't really feel compelled to be the sole caregiver for an animal. So it's okay. And my wife hates animals, so.
I bet if you got a dog, though, she'd like.
I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. She had dogs growing up too and hated them as a kid and has kept that into adulthood.
Can you see a picture of her? I'm really interested to see what she looks like.
My wife?
Yeah.
Tori met my daughter on Friday.
She was so cute.
Sure, I'll show a family picture at some point. So, there's a figure from chapter 22 that demonstrates it's an actual drawing that Darwin did to try to represent all of the diversity of life, all of the known diversity of life in a single grouping. So in chapter 22, we get a little bit of an introduction into something called a phylogeny. So this was all these definitions: adaptation, natural selection, and now I want to show you, okay, well, what's the big picture here? What's the big picture here? Okay? So we have structures that are called phylogenies, which basically are representations of the evolutionary history of a group. So in chapter 22, you get your first introduction into these, and I want to show you a little bit about one. I want to show you one that deals with organisms that are more familiar to you. In chapter 22, it does this for elephants and extinct groups that are like elephants, like the mastodon and the mammoth. I don't know how familiar those groups are to you, so I want to do this with something that's more familiar to you. Okay? Yeah.
What did you say these were called again?
Phylogenies?
How do you spell it?
That's a wonderful question.
PH. Yes.
That's science.
And it's the kind of graph, right?
Yeah, it's a tree is what it is, representing the history of a group. So let's say we wanted to do this, yeah.
You know, like a tree has like xylem and a phloem. But it doesn't make sense. I was gonna say like five phloem, you know, tree.
I got you.
That makes no sense.
Okay, so this tree is going to represent this group here, Canidae, which is the dog family. Okay, so we're going to draw a phylogeny or a phylogenetic tree. So phylogeny, sometimes called a cladogram, and sometimes called a phylogenetic tree. Phylogenetic tree or cladogram. They're all the same thing, just different names for the same object. All right. Okay. Bless you. Okay, and I'm going to keep this relatively simple because, yeah, it's just, I'm going to make this relatively simple. So here we would have foxes. Here we'd have something like an African wild dog. Here we would have a wolf. And here we would have our domestic dog. Okay? And so, yeah, Emma.
What are hyenas?
Hyenas are members of a different family, but they have some dog-like features. Yeah. That's a good question. All right. So what we're representing here is, again, the evolutionary history of this group. Did you have a question, Kyle?
Yeah, what's the dash on the left side?
This?
Yes.
It's a branch. And so every branch represents a historical form. Okay? Every branch represents a historical form. So this right here would be the original ancestor. Okay? The original ancestor. And then that then diversified into all of these different forms. Again, the idea here is descent with modification. Yeah, Mark.
Where would coyotes be?
Coyotes would be outside, would be like here, the same place as an African wild dog. If you want, we could erase that and put coyote.
I was driving to work out this morning.
Uh-huh.
Whatever it was, 5:45 in the morning.
Yeah.
I was driving, and there was like 3 coyotes in the middle of my street.
Did you run them over?
No,
We got
I
it.
started driving, and then I got bolted. It was pretty
Okay, so this branch right here represents the original ancestor. Every one of these, so let's draw a little circle here. These circles are called nodes. and they are speciation events. And so they are times in which, for some reason, your group represented by this branch or this branch or this branch splits and forms two different groups. So if you wanted to do this for all of the finches on the Galapagos Islands, you could do it, and every time you had a new species, you should have one of these nodes. A place where your branch splits into two branches. Okay? And so this is a phylogeny or a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram, and what it attempts to do is to explain the evolutionary history of the group. Now, these are representing ancestors. So these are nodes or speciation events. They are also ancestors. And so looking at this phylogeny, who shares a more recent common ancestor with the domestic dog? The wolf or the African wild dog? Mark.
Wolf.
How do you know?
Because it's because they share the same node.
Right, so you don't have to travel as far to get to a shared node. Again, representing a particular ancestor. Emma.
Would you use this when you do ultimate questions?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, this is very much an ultimate endeavor. Yep, very much so. So this gives you more fuel by which you can answer ultimate questions, providing the evolutionary history. Because remember, ultimate questions need to address fitness or the evolutionary history of a group. Right? So if you're asking a question of like, why do domestic dogs, when they are strays, hunt in packs? Yeah.
So this shows how closely related.
Yes. So if you were to ask the question, why do stray domestic dogs hunt in packs? How could you answer it? Remember, it's a why question, so we should deal with ultimate answers. Tori. What do you mean by stronger there? Yeah, Emma.
I don't know, wolves have a pack.
Yeah, so you could reference it as wolves hunt in packs, right? Since they share an ancestor with wolves, it would make sense that they would also hunt in packs, which would suggest that this ancestor hunted in packs. African wild dogs hunt in packs. Foxes rarely do. Foxes tend to be more solitary. Loners, yeah. So you could answer it that way, or since it's an ultimate question, we could also address fitness. Lydia.
Like hunting in packs benefits their fitness.
Yeah, we would say that that's how they maximize their fitness, maximize their reproductive output. Because hunting in a pack, they can take out something larger than they could individually and have more hunting success. All right? So you asked the question, Emma, why are there so many breeds of dogs? Right? And so Darwin used a lot of artificial selection research to actually support his idea of natural selection. So he said, okay, there's overwhelming evidence that organisms change through time, that they're not static, they're not fixed, and instead they change through time. And he argued that natural selection is the primary means by which they descend with modification. And he used artificial selection as an example of that. Okay? So somebody give me an area other than breeds of dogs where there's artificial selection that we've used to accomplish to get what we wanted. Yeah,
I'm
Isa.
assuming, this is a wild guess, butterflies maybe?
Okay. Yeah, there is some of that in there, although not as much. Lydia. Horses, yeah. Right, we've got all these different breeds of horses, right? You want a miniature horse that's about the size of a Great Dane, you could do it, right? You can do it. You want it, you can make it happen, right? And you want a massive horse that can pull by itself a whole a carriage, right, full of things. You want something like a Clydesdale, you can do it, right? Only allow the largest, most powerful individuals to breed. A giant fiddler crab. right? If you wanted to do some artificial selection. Any other ideas? Yeah, Mark.
Cats.
Cats? Good. So, yeah, Emma. Fish?
I don't know. Like,
Sure. There's some of that. Yeah, I mean, there's a big trade. Michelle.
Just a question for the
Yeah.
horse. I know there's a horse who like brown skin, white flat. It's like the blood is. I mean the sweating is like the blood. It's
Okay.
like red. It's like.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. Sorry, Mark.
Like I don't know about this one, but lizards maybe.
Okay.
Because I know, like, I used to have a bearded dragon, and I know that there are like several different little mini species of bearded dragon.
Yeah.
That I've seen around.
So some of the most impressive. I mean, so different dogs are pretty impressive, right? You've got everything from a Chihuahua to like a Saint Bernard, right? It's a pretty impressive amount of variation coming from a single species. And by the way, these two are the same species. Both are Canis lupus. Anyways, so, but plants, artificial selection experiments on plants are far more impressive than artificial selection experiments in animals. So, I don't know if you know this or not, but broccoli, kale, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, mustard, they all come from one single plant that is here. It's a wild mustard plant. You find it growing along roadsides, and all of those different agricultural products came from artificial experiments on that plant.
What was the original?
So broccoli is not like a natural thing.
I mean, it's the flower of a mustard plant, and then you select it for a specific type of flower. Yeah.
So what's the difference between cauliflower and broccoli?
I mean, just
Thank you.
It's white.
yeah. I mean, they're both the flower of the wild. They both come from the flower.
Okay. So they're the same thing.
Okay. Okay. Now, if you were, may I erase this? Okay. So, if natural selection is your only source or your only mechanism by which you could get descent with modification, what do you need to have? Okay, so if natural selection is going to generate different forms, right? So natural selection is going to generate the different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, or is going to generate the different types of dog species. What do you need to have be true? What has to be true? Yeah.
And there's big stress on it in some way.
Okay, there needs to be some kind of stress. Good. Kyle.
Yeah, kind of going on like different environments.
Okay, that there has to be different environments to apply different types of stress. Any other ideas? Yeah, so if natural selection is going to generate all the different types of dog species we have, or all the different types of species of finches on the Galapagos Island, what has to also be true? What does natural selection need?
You know, like the factor that affects species.
Okay? So we have stress listed as one. We have, you talked about different environments. We'll just say different pressures. Environments would also be true there. We're missing a big one. You have to have variation on which to act, right? If there are no differences among the members of a population, it doesn't matter how much pressure there is or how much stress is, because every individual is the same, right? We need an amount of variation. Okay, and so what Darwin noted is that animals tend to vary in form. So when you study a species across its entire range, you find some unique and meaningful variation, right? Think about humans, right? If you study humans throughout our entire range, you see some very unique and meaningful differences. Stress, he also noticed that animals produce more offspring than can survive. We mentioned this one already. Animals tend to produce more offspring than can survive. This provides the stress. And so, what he inferred then is that some individuals are going to have features that make them more successful. Some individuals are going to have features that make them more successful. They survive better, or they produce more offspring, or their offspring survive better, ultimately increasing their fitness. And then over time, that what this is going to fuel is that a population is going to change through time as more and more individuals in that population have whatever these beneficial features are. So you could start with something that's really rare. It's a really rare type of variation, but if it's successful and it gives the individuals higher levels of success where they have higher fitness, then over time the population is going to shift in that direction. Just locked Dr. Phillips out. Yeah, but it's okay. He walked that way. All right. So let's think about this. Let's go back to the Galapagos finches. Let's say most of the finches have a small beak. Okay? Most of the finches of a particular species have a small beak. What are they going to eat? Yeah.
Small seeds.
Small seeds, right? But then you get one individual that just has a really beast of a beak. I mean, this is just impressive, this monstrosity. And so now that individual can eat seeds no other member of his species can.
The beak that makes all other beaks look.
Absolutely. Make all other beaks look like they aren't even beaks, right? No, this is a beak. I was going to reference a movie, but I doubt very many of you have seen it. Crocodile Dundee.
No.
They go to get, so the whole gist of the movie is this reporter from New York City goes to visit this guy in Australia that survived a crocodile attack. Okay? And then she brings him back to New York City with her because the paper just loves him, right? So they want to bring him back. They want to, just take him to different things because it's making the paper a lot of money. Do y'all know newspapers, what they are?
Yes.
Okay. And so they're in New York City, and somebody comes to mug them, and he's got like a little switchblade. And then she's like, "Oh, give him your money. He's got a knife." And he says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." And he pulls out something that's got like a 14-inch blade, right? And so it's kind of this idea of the finches, like, that's not a beak. This is a beak, right?
Show you a knife.
And so
Let me show you a knife.
now you've got this individual can eat seeds no other member of his species can. Wildly successful morph, right? Because no other species can eat that type of seed, so you have all these seeds lying around, nobody's eating them. And so now this individual can eat as much as he wants. He's going to have a higher probability of survival. If his offspring have a large beak like he does, his offspring are going to have greater success. Therefore, they're going to survive longer on average. And now his reproductive output is increased. And over time, you would expect the population to shift more in the favor of large beak, especially as all the small seeds get eaten.
So they all started from somewhere, like a small beak, right? So then how would, is there just something like
Yeah, so the variation has to come from somewhere, right? Natural selection cannot generate variation. What it does is working with present variation, it can change a population. But it would have to come from somewhere. probably from a mutation or from what you would call recombination. You know, we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks. But in sexually reproducing animals, you have 2 copies of your entire genome, right? One that came from your mom and one that came from your dad. When you go to make gametes, you're going to mix the 2. So you'll get some features from your dad and some features of your mom in every one of your gametes, right? It's why you probably have, if you think about it, like you have some characteristics that match your maternal grandparents and some features that match your paternal grandparents, right? And or you could even, if you just restricted it to one side, you probably have some features that match your mom's dad and some features that match your mom's mom, right? Because your mom is able to mix her 2 parents when she made the gamete that produced you. Okay? And that's something sexually reproducing animals can do, and so you get unique combinations. So it either would be from that would have resulted in a large beak for the first time, or a entirely new version of that gene through a mutation. Yeah, Emma.
So I know that some features can be combined. So if a bird with a large beak and one with a small beak were to reproduce, would it have like a medium beak or would it just adopt a large beak?
It depends on how many genes contribute to that feature. If it's a single gene that contributes to that feature, it would probably be what we would call a dominant recessive relationship. We'll talk more about this in a couple weeks with inheritance. But the overwhelming majority of cases when it deals with like the size of a structure, it's usually a lot of genes contributing to that. And so you would end up with something intermediate. Yeah, intermediate. All right. We've talked about that. Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve through time. Individuals don't adapt, population adapts. Natural selection cannot create variation. All right.
Animals don't evolve.
But dead animals don't evolve, right? You need to get living animals in the first place. Okay? And so what we're going to continue to do as we go through 22, so between now and Wednesday, you're going to read through 23, and 23 is all about microevolution. It's about changes in allele frequencies. The rest of chapter 22, what we're going to do is talk about, is there evidence that organisms change through time? Is there evidence against what you would call fixity of species? And you're probably sitting there thinking, I sure hope so, because we've seen it happen, right? We've seen it happen. Are there any questions here? So remember, natural selection cannot create variation. The variation has to already be in place. And like Kyle asked, like, where did that first large beak individual come from? And it came from either a unique combination of features, as the individual, made gametes with which combined features from its parents, or it was something entirely new, a mutation that resulted in a new form. That latter one is rare. Mutations are almost always detrimental, and very quickly natural selection gets rid of them because they are what you would call deleterious. Okay? They detract from the organism. All right? Most often it's going to be recombination, mixing features from your parents as you make your gametes. All right? Make sense? Okay. All right. So you'll read chapter 23 in preparation for Wednesday. Are there any questions? Yeah, Michelle. Hey guys, shh. Michelle's asking a question. I can't hear.
So all the offspring needed to choose like whatever like adaptation from their parents?
Well, the offspring, you don't get to choose as you're making your gametes. You don't get to choose what are the best features. It's somewhat random.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's almost entirely random. The only thing that keeps it from being entirely random is some combinations don't work, and so those gametes would never produce living offspring. Right? Some combinations just don't work. And so, yeah, if the gametes can't produce a viable offspring, then